Yeah, so thanks for this opportunity. And what I really want to do this evening is just explore with you this question of what can rewilding offer our cities and our citizens in our cities? Is it something which happens in the countryside, or could we have an urban version of rewilding? And I was going to do a talk which has got 6 parts to it. So just to give you a little roadmap of what to expect. I'll start with a little preamble. Then I'll just present my take on rewilding. Then there's a moment for a brief philosophical interlude, and then I'll reflect on my experiences in urban conservation, and then go on from that to say, well, why would we want to do rewilding? What would be the purpose of rewilding in urban areas? And suggest to you that there would be a purpose. And then I'll finish off with some ideas on how we might begin to do urban rewilding. And part of the idea is I thought along the way I would we could have a little quiz, so I could interject. Forget how many I've got now. 10 quiz questions along the way. And the idea here is that if you'd like to take part in this quiz, no pressure, is I'll give you the question and then put the answer in the chat. And Jeff will be looking at the chat, and the first 5 people to get the right answer will get into the sort of list on it. And then the one who gets all the right answers, or closest to all the right answers at the end, can get a signed copy. He leans over of the illustrated edition of my book. So that's just yeah, it's an evening just to add a little bit of fun into the proceedings. So let's start off. I always like to just start off with this reflection about how rewilding, this term which we're interested in, is entering, well, it started off in the academic and the practitioner domain, now it moved into the cultural domain, and now it's entering the policy mainstream. And I'm sure you're familiar with all the cultural stuff, all the books on it, all the social media chat on it. It's exponential number of academic articles, but now it's really there in high-level policy. In the recent global biodiversity framework, restoring ecosystem integrity, the technical word for rewilding was there as in there as goal A. So it's something which is really of our time. And a couple of years ago, I've done quite a lot of work on social movement theory. I was thinking, wow, rewilding, is it starting to exhibit social movement characteristics? It's got a lot of the characteristics of a social movement. It's got new goals, a new narrative, a fresh scientific footing, which I'm going to talk about a bit in a moment. Compelling demonstration projects, NEP or the Gelderseepoort in the Netherlands. There's a guiding set of principles, which I'll touch on. There's quite a lot of public enthusiasm for rewilding, and it's beginning to get that high-level support. And I think all effective social movements need this. It had the beginnings of an organizational form. But it's interesting, when I was putting this talk together, I introduced or was into this. And it's because I think in Britain, rewilding has sort of occupied this or entered the public mainstream at quite a difficult time for us, really. It's come at a time when, there's deep divisions in Britain about Brexit and, all sort of what's going on. And there's a lot of strife, of discussions and COVID and all of this thing. It entered a real time of, I suppose, cultural unease and uncertainty and perhaps defensiveness of groups. And that all in the background of social media, where sometimes there's bickerings about what it should be or shouldn't be. Other times there's all these people coming up as social media influence, as saying, well, this is what rewilding is. And I do wonder whether, and we can might discuss this in the discussion, whether one of the problems we're facing at the moment is that rewilding just has too many meanings for it to get that focus as a social movement. That's not starting off a negative thing, but I think that this is relevant to how it may enter, or how we might do rewilding in an urban area. So although there's many meanings, I wanted to give you a brief introduction to if you like, the rewilding I came to know both through my research and through engagements with the European rewilding movement, the European pioneer European rewilders. And this started off back in 2005, 2006, when I started taking my students over to the Netherlands, and then sort of maintained through my engagement, as an academic in research and teaching on it. And I think this has really, it's really shaped my view on rewilding. So I'd just like to share that with you and some of, if you like, the key points in my mind on it. I think for me, one of the really interesting things is where this idea of rewilding emerged from. And it emerged in this sort of this beautiful blending, I suppose, of different ways of thinking. So there was the inductive science of the field ecologists, and particularly the Dutch field ecologists and those working in the Indian Ocean islands and so forth, who were just observing how nature was restoring or how they were recovering or whatever, and had started to ask quite critical questions of the ecology they had been taught. At the same time, there was the more deductive, the science of the academy, the science in universities, who were really being able to push new boundaries in ecology thanks to advances in technology. We could understand the past better, we could model better, we could deal with bigger data sets. And then there was these sort of real world, sort of quite radical projects of sort of quite experienced conservationists just saying, we need to start pushing the edge together. And out of this sort of interaction came, for me, the notion of rewilding. And for me, there's some really interesting new understandings here. One of them was this, what we call the unsettling past baselines, or notions of what we think is the natural. And this was really aided by technology, in particular advances in paleoecology, paleobotany, the ability to pick up little phytoliths from the silica in grass and really get that sense of past ecosystems. And from that, we realized that there were multiple past natures, but also the real understandings about how across most of Europe and across most of Europe, the natural state, or the state which had evolved before humans had big impacts, was one of megafauna, African-like ecosystems across the world. But that ability to sort of look more further past also started enabling us to benchmark and position the natures we're in, and then stop looking for natural reference points, but set these new conservation ambitions. It's almost like we just had this longer view. We had a rather short-sighted, in the temporal scale, view of rewilding. And that was almost quite freeing, this sort of freedom to set new conservation ambitions and to restore ecosystems with a degree of natural autonomy. So this moves on to the first quiz question, actually. So Scotland interests me because Scotland is one of the first nations I know which has decided to say, well, hang on, this is the nature we think is Scottish, these moorlands and so forth. But is that the nature we want going forward, or how good is this nature? And they've started to do something of benchmarking themselves against other countries. So saying, look, this is where we are biogeographically, we're in this latitude, longitude, we've got this sort of climate, we've got this sort of land on it. Where are other countries or regions which are in the same position in the world as us, and what do they look like? And they've basically, Scottish rewilders and more generally policymakers are starting to benchmark themselves against one country and one region on it. And I just want to, so this is the first quiz question for 2 points. Which might those be? So I'll give you 15 seconds to put some suggestions in the chat, and then I'll tell you the answer. And oh, we've got one there: Poland, Norway, Sweden, Scandinavia. Any more? Okay, I'll give you a tip that Norway is okay, but Norway's the region, so there is a region within Norway. Denmark, Scotland and Chile. Yeah, okay. So the one you missed there, so basically Scotland is benchmarking itself against Alaska, which is amazing. There are salmon rivers and brown bears. And also also Southwest Norway. And Southwest Norway is interesting because Southwest Norway was very like Scotland 70 years ago until there was huge deep rural depopulation when people moved across to America on that. Let me move the chat out my window there. This big insight, which I alluded to a moment, is this understanding that the ecosystems of today, or the ecosystems of our epoch, they co-evolved with megafauna. So there was this hothouse world, the dinosaurs have gone out of the way, the trees got the upper hand, a hothouse world of tree stuff, then the world got very, there was a lot of tectonic activity, trees started falling down, grasslands emerged, the small mammals which retained came out into the grasslands, they became megafauna, they started to be able to impact the woody vegetation and create these mosaics that keeping grasslands opening, and all of the ecotones, which created huge microhabitat diversity. And from that microhabitat diversity, there was a proliferation of species and that biological abundance and biodiversity, which perhaps we all cherish and aspire to recover. So this is a key insight of it. These sort of, images which were probably once more widespread of 15,000 years ago across Europe. And then it also gave us this deepening understanding of how we as ecosystem engineers have impacted and structured and affected those landscapes. So the overkill, the overhunting of the megafauna, which led to their demise, the taming and domestication of both land and livestock, the ordering of land, the draining of land, and perhaps in the last 50 years, this real sort of extracting everything we can get for produce and agricultural commodities. The other bit, I think, which came from this era of rewilding was these guiding concepts on it. That, well, how can we take this to recover ecosystems? What do we need to put in place? There's a really important work coming out of Aarhus University in Denmark, which sort of synthesized a lot of this together and said, well, if we can increase the ability of organisms to disperse across landscapes, that process will help nature recover. If we can add to that to restoring some of that natural disturbance in landscapes, which we've sort of ordered out, that will help things. And then if we can restore trophic complexity, that will do it. Oh, and the best way to restore trophic complexity is to put those mega herbivores back into the mix. And through these processes, these dynamics, these system interactions, the sort of ecosystem or the whole food web complexity and the system interactions will spin up in this sort of spinning top idea. So this is a key conceptual idea which underpinned European rewilding. And I think the other bit which underpinned it was this realization that, actually we're quite lucky in Europe because we have a lot of the original megafauna still surviving. This is a set of the European mega herbivores. It's just that some of those mega herbivores are culturally extinct as wild fauna. We don't think of them as wild fauna, but they're still with us. The aurochs, we just call them a cow now. The water buffalo, we call a buffalo, and horses, we call ponies on it. But if we've bred them to domestication, we now have the technology to backbreed them to be analogues of their original wild ancestors. And this is one of the exciting developments in rewilding. Others, we've just forgotten that they're there. The wild asses, which used to be right the way around the Mediterranean, they're still over in Eastern Europe. And some of them, like the European bison, we had too much American TV, cowboys and Indians when we were kids, and perhaps forgotten that they are actually still with us as European species. So that's just a little flavour of some of the science which has inspired me in rewilding. And it was just before COVID, actually, the whole group of European rewilding practitioners, sort of thought leaders, came together and put together these rewilding principles of how rewilding might be done in practice. And some of those are ecological, like let nature lead, work at nature's scale. Others, though, were very much about the spirit of rewilding, like leading with stories of hope, thinking creativity, working with people, acting in context, working together, and not putting rewilding out there as something which has, this is the way to do it, that there's different approaches to conservation, and it can complement existing approaches to conservation. And these principles still, I think they still guide me in my work, and I do commend them actually. They're quite not, they're simply put, but quite they fit together very nicely. And overall, perhaps the overarching principle of European rewilding was just to embrace pragmatism and do what we can do within the realities of what is possible, but also push those boundaries too. Oh, sorry, I forgot a question. Okay, quickly, second quiz question for the evening is what European megafauna is extinct and is perhaps unlikely to become back. So let's have a quick one. And when I say megafauna, this should be quite an easy one. So European megafauna, which was around till 20,000 years ago and is now extinct. Oh yeah, you're all getting that one. Too easy, wasn't it? Oh, hippos. That was a good one. Yeah, so the auroch, Zandra, that's the one which is still a cow. So there's now Tauros, which is the auroch one. Yeah, the giant bear. I didn't quite catch it. I didn't quite count that as a herbivore. I had that more down in the omnivore one. But I think the right answer to that, or the one I was looking for, was the mammoth as the herbivore, which was once here and then perhaps unlikely to come back. Okay, so are you ready for a bit of philosophy now? Because I think because rewilding is all about ecosystems. And when, I was in a geography department, and a lot of us, when we were thinking about this, we were really moving to, getting back into systems thinking, if you like. And this takes us into relational philosophy. So these are the sort of questions which geographers, or at least the geographers at Oxford, were asking now. These questions about, where does reality reside? Where are these things located? Where are things which are really important in the organization or the conduct of the world, things such as power, agency, and value, and identity? Where are these concepts? Where are these things located? These things which, shape us and shape the world around them. And the answer to this, it comes from actor network theory, is that all of these things are located in networks of relationships. They're not out there. I don't have agency by myself. I only have agency in relation to something else. So that agency it is somewhere located between me and something else, if I see myself as an agent there. And then this sort of idea that many things we value, we call them emergent properties. They're emergent properties of systems relationships. So things like power, agency, happiness, all of these things, they're emergent properties of interactions. And these systems relationships, they can be designed to an extent, but and managed, but the outcomes can only be steered. We can't prescribe what nature wants to be, just like we can't prescribe, what social media, what we'd like social media to be like, or what we want AI to be like at the moment. These are really, the systems have a life of their own and have an emergence of their own. So this was quite key to the idea of natural autonomy in ecosystems and recovering that nature as a force, recovering those system interactions. And also this understanding that although we might want to protect and manage biodiversity, that is actually coming from the system. And if we can restore the system interactions, biodiversity will be an outcome. It may not be the same nature or biodiversity we had in the past, but it will be hopefully a flourishing and diverse nature. So it's the integrity of the systems which matter rather than the composition of the outcomes of those systems, which was a key philosophical idea in rewilding. Also, quite a lot of us in Oxford, I think a lot of academics were really starting to think through the implications of the technological revolution on this. And one of my favorite Tech Future books was this one by Kevin Kelly, where Kevin Kelly was one of the founding editors of Wired magazine. And he wrote this book on the sort of 10 technological forces, which he felt were going to shape the future. Bearing in mind that, technology is a system now, and it's probably bigger than us all, and it's got its own agency and its own future. And he gave labels to these forces. And I was really struck how many of the labels, which he was, sort of his analysis of technology, aligned with things and concepts we were thinking of in rewilding and ecosystem recovery. So concepts of becoming, concepts of flowing, concepts of remixing species, the concepts in the rewilding movement of questioning current practice, of interacting and just beginning things. And then other things which are sort of more in the ecological assessment area of tracking with technology, of using screens. I mean, we're screening now. So I was really taken about how he was talking in sort of very relational terms, just as we were talking in relational terms, both in a sort of geographic philosophical term, but also in ecosystems. And then there was this other, could ask for hands up here if we know how many of you have read Sapiens. The next quiz question is, who is the author of this? This really amazing piece of historical analysis by this very gifted Israeli historian. And what, for me, he was really talking about here was this notion of reality, and pointing out that as humans, we lived in a triple reality: the reality of the physical things, it's cold outside, that rock's hard, the reality of our emotions, I feel upset, I feel angry, I feel happy, and then the intersubjective realities which we create through our stories and our ability to storify things, and then create institutions out of that, institutions of marriage, presidents, money, all of these things, and how that intersubjective reality shapes our life. And I think I'll come on to this in a moment, because I think this is really important in terms of how rewilding is starting to tell different stories of nature and our relationship with it. And those stories are in themselves a force, and a force for the future as well. So I've taken us into that, if you like, interlude of philosophy, just to sort of give some background into sort of how we might think about doing urban rewilding, but also I think about how a lot of us are thinking about rewilding, those of us who are working professionally in institutional design or whatever, and more radical aspects of institutional design are thinking about rewilding. Okay, so who got the author of the book there? Let's, oh yes, Lucy got it, Alison got it, Zach got it. Oh, only 3 so much so far. Okay, so it's Yuval Noah Harari, for those of you who are interested, and I recommend it if you haven't read it. By the way, it's a great book.
Yeah, they're about 6 minutes right, Paul, a couple further back.
All right, sorry about that, folks. Not recognised it. So I want to know, sort of take you back to the beginning of my career. So, I've talked about rewilding and how it's been a real big thing in my life for perhaps the last 15 years, and interacting with perhaps some of the theorization and conceptual work I was doing in Oxford. But of course, I just started off like everybody. I left Manchester with not a particularly good degree. Manchester University, passionate about birding, wanted to work into working in conservation. And I was lucky because I graduated in 1981 from Manchester. And this was just at that time when Manchester was really starting to think about urban regeneration, and how to sort of, it had been on its knees in the 60s and 70s, this post-industrial past, and it had some really gifted council officers, and nobody knows where this idea came from, except that it came from the local authorities. But somebody had this idea of, let's bring countryside back into the city on it. Let's have that as part of our urban regeneration vision. And how, let's intertwine nature in the lived reality of our citizens and create this sort of more livable, more investable, better naturey image for the city. So I was lucky that when I graduated, this agenda was just taking off, and I got a job with a very young ranger service, which was tasked with bringing back countryside into an area of South Manchester called the Mersey Valley. And that, in the top box, basically, this is the River Mersey runs down the side of Manchester, down the south of Manchester, for those of you who know it. And basically, you couldn't build on it. So the city had just tipped everything it could into it, or needed to tip into it over the years. So it had, you know, it had the old refuge tips. It had all the bomb site clearance just tipped in it. You know, big mounds of stuff. It had all the asbestos clearance was put in one tip. And then it had borrow pits for building the M63. It had old derelict sewage works. It was a mess. And basically what they did was they capped the tips with clay and then said, right, okay, young people, they appointed a team, an interdisciplinary team of 7 people. I think we're all under 25. The chief warden was 32. They gave us a budget of 350 grand a year and just said, make something happen, basically. It was a true innovation space. And we did a pretty good job of this. We had works teams as well on it. And it was really about the idea, it was all driven by the idea of creating new leisure assets. That at that time in Manchester, leisure provision was formal provision, sports halls, you know, football pitches, swimming pools. And they had this stat that only 10% of the population used them for 10% of their life. Whereas with nature, you know, 80% of the population could potentially use them for 80% of their life. It was that sort of idea. And it was a great vision, and it was a really exciting vision to be part of, shaped by that notion of restoring countryside. And one day, I was the ecological land manager. I was a countryside ranger and an ecological land manager. And I was driving between sites in my, I had a Datsun, metallic green Datsun 120Y with a black roof. It was, I mean, Datsuns weren't the coolest car to have in Manchester in those days, but it was pretty decent. And everybody listened to Radio Piccadilly. And I was driving along between 2 sites, and you know, the DJ said, "I've just got to play you this new tune." This was in the early 80s from Manchester, and they played this track, and I'd never heard anything like it. It was so out there, so fresh. And the next quiz question is, what's the name of the band and what's the name of the track I'm referring to? But I can still remember this point. I was almost overwhelmed with a sense of pride that this amazing music, this totally novel music, was coming out of a city, and a city where I was a local government officer. And it did get me to think, was like, whoa, you know, I'm doing something supposedly progressive in this city. You know, I'm restoring nature. I'm, you know, part of that. Am I part of that urban vibe of it? And how might we connect the work we're doing in the Mersey Valley with this attitude and creativity that was just bulging? It was just bulging out of Manchester at the moment. I mean, the Hacienda Caine was just emerging on it. So I don't have a total answer to this, but I'll go on to it in a moment. But anybody got the not the no, not Joy Division. It could have been Joy Division. After Joy Division, whoever got that? Not the Stowe Roses. I think it was 1983. Andy's on the right way. New Order, it was. Anybody get the song? Yeah, so it was New Order, Blue Monday. And maybe there's some people of the same age as I who can still remember when they first heard that. It was really exciting. But the point I wanted to make here, and which I'll come back to on urban natures and urban rewilding, is that wouldn't it be brilliant if we could connect the recovering force of nature with those forces of creativity, cultural creativity, which are in our cities. I did take some of this vibe into my work in Manchester. We had a, sorry, I'm just watching the time here a little bit. We had these work teams that every summer they would do balsam, Himalayan balsam bashing, because Himalayan balsam was seen as a, what do you call it, an exotic, invasive weed and not natural and not part of the countryside. But then we also had to do guided walks every 2 weeks. And it was so interesting hearing people, and they're saying, oh, you know, can't wait until the Himalayan balsam goes, you know, just such a beautiful show every August. We just love it when it happens. And I came to realize that the Himalayan balsam show for citizens of Manchester was the sort of, you know, the purple haze of bluebells, which countryside people may have. So I also came to realize that, citizens enjoy nature just for its inherent beauty. There's no sense of what is natural, and that doesn't affect it. And also that ecosystems are happy to be cosmopolitan. I mean, being an ecologist on these old tip sites, there are all sorts of different mixes of things. And I think that led into a deep sense in myself, which is very much part of European rewilding principles. It's just that let nature lead a little bit. Don't be too prescriptive. So just to conclude this little bit, the urban conservation movement really was gaining momentum in the 1980s. There was big projects in Manchester, had the River Valley projects. Sheffield was quite big. Nottingham was big. The Lee Valley in Scotland, in London. Telford Newtown had its own countryside service in there. It was a movement very much led by local government officers, but interestingly, it also happened at the same time as those of you remember that graduate employment scheme, Manpower Services. So actually, my girlfriend at the time was at 25 was leading a team of 60 people doing the Telford Newtown urban conservation planning. And it manifested in, a number of visions. There was nice books by Richard Maybury, The Unofficial Countryside. But going back to that music analogy, I think that as a movement there, we were never able to just put aside the notions of trying to create this authentic countryside, or something we imagined as countryside from our countryside holidays. And in a sense, it started to fizzle out because of that. I don't think we ever really connected with the urban vibe. But also perhaps more of the reason it fizzled out was because there was this big conference in 1992 in Rio. And the next question, it was called the United Nations Conference on Environmental and Development. The next quiz question is, what was this conference more popularly known as? It had a more popular label to it, 2 words for it. See if anybody can guess that. And I'm going to just carry on talking while you put that in it. But this conference really brought biodiversity up into the international domain. And that cascaded down into the need for governments to deliver biodiversity action plans, and then the need for local authorities to develop biodiversity action plans. And that sort of, I don't know, like just creativity or just, what do you call it? Flexibility of the urban conservation movement started to become all a little bit more technocratic and all a little bit more structured in planning on it. And nature, rather than it just being an asset for people to, capture whatever value they could, or cities to capture whatever value they could from, it became reframed as biodiversity and this natural resource, which, was a bit more, just didn't have the same connectivity, if you like, with other walks of life like countryside or nature did. Okay, lots of good people got that. Caroline, Debbie, I'm looking at the Earth Summit, the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. So I think the narrative I'm providing here is that urban conservation was really taking off in the 1980s, but that movement sort of fizzled out. It probably also fizzled out partly because there was all of this outsourcing of council services. There wasn't enough money in local authorities to employ rangers such as I was anymore. They got rolled back. And a lot of things were outsourced and then became more specified. And I would argue that one of the problems we have now more generally in our cities is that our civic systems have become ever more structured in their own right. And we've lost many of those interactions in between them. And, there's all sorts of issues we keep talking about at the moment. But that maybe when I go on to this next question of how can rewilding become urban, and what can rewilding offer to urban areas or our cities, it is about restoring those connections and those networks and those systems, between institutions, between people and nature, between nature and technology. And for me, the question which guides me on this is, how can we blend the recovering force of nature? So if we're doing rewilding in the cities, with those forces of technology and urban culture to shape a better future for us all. I'm going to flip over this one, actually. I just wanted to say that rewilding is mostly a regenerative agenda outside cities. But, you know, why should we do rewilding? And for me, I think it's about this question of rebuilding or restoring mental resilience among our citizens. There's been some really powerful reports in the last year, actually, talking about our mental well-being, public mental well-being, and being under assault. You know, negative views about the future have surged to unprecedented highs in society. And then these arguments that if we don't invest in systems to strengthen mental health and emotional risk, we risk getting into this vicious cycle where we're less able to deal with the effects of climate change and other changes going ahead. So we get into this negative spiral of a lack of resilience just at a time in human history when we really need that resilience in there. And it was really put nicely in this IPBES report where they were saying, look, healthy ecosystems are more resilient to climate change. But this isn't only true of natural ecosystems, it's true of human and societal ecosystems too. So for me, urban rewilding is about thinking about how we can use our knowledge, our abilities, our enthusiasm of nature's to rebuild different connections, networks, systems within our urban settings, and to do that in quite a creative way. And there's these guides, you know, it's like when you look at this, these things that people think are necessary to restore mental resilience, connectivity, function, you know, thriving, coping. And you just look at those lists of things there, which I'm not going to read through, but how much of that can come through interactions with nature and the activities, all the different types of activities we have of recovering nature and just getting active in nature recovery in cities on it. And I think one of the great things of rewilding and one of the things which I offer, which I've written about in relation to this, is that rewilding offers this hopeful and empowering environmental narrative. It's not the classic environmental narrative of saying, oh, you know, my goodness, things are in a bad state, you know, it's going to be catastrophe. God, you know, we've got to blame the corporates or the incompetent government for this. We're going to pressure others to do things. And, you know, it's all a bit, oh, you know, blame and guilt and all of this sort of thing. Rewilding, actually, the narrative structures of rewilding actually map quite well onto narrative structures of people recovering from mental health. This idea of like, oh, you know, I'm down, I'm a bit desperate on one of these. And then you have these periods of awakening people talk about. Then they start doing something, and then that helps them change their attitudes and reevaluate. And out of that comes recovery. And I did do a bit of an analysis of this on books such as Wilding. And it's quite interesting how narratives of rewilding tend to use this structure. And it's not blaming people, it's just saying, look, this is where we're at. Let's just make things better and let's get going on doing that ourselves. So just to finish off, and I'm slightly speeding up here, so there will be, I think there's another quiz question, but I've just missed out 2 of them. Just some of the ideas on how, or ideas I've had on how we might begin, or how I might like to begin urban rewilding. I'm sure you've got some ideas, and let's hope we can hear some of those in the Q&A. But just to give you some illustrative illustrations of how this might be. And this is taking inspiration from some past ideas as well. This is a road near me called Poplar Drive. It hasn't got any trees on it. I think one of the most obvious things of urban rewilding is to try and get the street trees back in. And there's a lovely, talking about Manchester again, Manchester applied to be a national forest, one of the national forests in 1991. And it had this idea of like, forests don't have to be outside, they can be overlapping the cities. And it introduced this policy where that if they would plant trees in the streets of any community which agreed that they want them. So they asked for volunteers to go and knock on the doors. They gave them 5 options they could have in trees, and then if everybody signed up for it, they sent them back in, and then the arboricultural department came down and planted trees. I think things like that are still very possible. And there's a good health reason to do this as well, because there's a growing body of science which is showing how, what do you call it, interactions with microbiota and microbiota at different levels, you know, things which basically come off vegetation, how they're really good for our immune system. And as we know, a strong immune system is quite linked to mental health. But this seems to be a really, I mean, is this rewilding? I think it is rewilding in terms of making those system connections again. So that's one idea. Another idea, which I put a little blog out actually in lockdown, is what I call backyard rewilding. When you look at our gardens, lots of us have sort of put these fences around them. So you're in these little, what do you call it, cells, if you like, on it. And you remember going back to that science when I said that dispersal was one of the key processes which rewilding seeks to recover. If organisms can just flow across space, things are better off. So one of the ideas here is that a lot of people build these fences right the way to the bottom of their garden, but actually you can put a trellis at the back of your garden and plant a bit of honeysuckle over it. And then you've got those corridors, those flows going through. Don't go down the back of our gardens. But when we do, if we go down there and you bump into your neighbour, you just have a nice chat. So you've still got the privacy, but you've got the opportunity to connect with your nature, with your neighbour, and nature has an opportunity to flow. And again, you do wonder whether, we've got, what do you call it, the councils and government has done a lot on incentivising people to insulate their homes. Could we do the same thing? Could we be incentivising people to make the back gardens a little bit more connected in these sorts of ways and bump up nature in that way? I think there's quite a lot we could be doing in terms of rethinking how we do ecological network planning in our cities. And of course, this is coming in again under the new environmental bill and biodiversity net gaining planning and the need of councils to sort of create these ecological networks which fit into an England-wide ecological networks. At the moment, we tend to think about, the ecological networks can only be at ground level. But why does it need to be at ground level? We've got loads of flat roofs out there. You look at any more central part of the city, there's a lot of flat roofs. We put solar panels on certain ones of these, other ones aren't suited for that. We could be putting sort of more ephemeral, arid, what do you call it? Arid tolerance or wet and, habitats which can take extremes on our roofs. And then using all cities have wind flows and wind tunnels going through them. And those, the microbiota are again just sort of flowing between the roofs and the down and the lower areas in the city and creating this system again, these flows going within the city. Part of this is also the idea of daylighting culverts. There's a lot of asphalt in our cities which are unneeded. Another very simple thing is that when I do go into green space in cities, often this is along the river corridors, some of them are grazed on it. And you always get these fences going in, and every fence seems to be put in straight. This is one just 5 minutes from my house, actually, in Oxford. And all of the dogs run along the edge of this fence from the footpath this side. And the other side of the fence, there's a major cycleway. So all the dogs dive in from the other side of the fence. So there's no refuge here for animals. There's no refuge for rabbits or deer or all that sort of stuff. It's just really ordered again. It doesn't take much to do a wavy fence on it. Equally now, and going on to the theme of technology, those cattle in the fields don't actually have to be fenced because you can put the fence on them. So here is a quiz question as we go along. If you notice, those cows have got a little, almost like a cowbell on them. Does anybody know the name of this technology, which is coming into UK conservation quite quickly at the moment? Virtual fences. What it means is that you can track every cow on your iPhone. And again, I think this would require different types of grazing. So a lot of grazing at the moment in urban areas is done by bringing a contractor in. That contractor doesn't live near the cows. So of course they want them to be penned in so that there's nothing happens and they can live in comfort that their cows aren't going to get into trouble on it. But these ideas of geofencing them and having these herds, I think they could work if they had local guardians and local people saying, yeah, we'll track the cows, and if there's anything wrong with them, we'll go and check them out and call in if necessary. Great, we've got quite a few there. No fence is the name of the technology there. Okay, second to last idea here. This was some work we did with Ecological actually for Bristol, just some sort of brainstorming type work, which was to think about how in urban rewilding, we might be able to extend the purpose of some of our civic institutions, and in particular, museums. And our museums are there. They've always curated natural history along with other things on it. They have a lot of skills on it. At the moment, we have lots of citizen science apps, which it makes it really easy for citizens to collate data and feed that up into what are called the global biodiversity repositories. Bristol has been very progressive, that it's actually introduced a wildlife index. So it's going to say it's going to report to its citizens on how wildlife is doing every year. And one of the ideas here is, well, what about this new role for museums where they're using the curatorial skills to curate these citizen science communities, able to create digital twins between the nature which is being reported in the city and the nature which is being exhibited in the museum, and through this feed into the wildlife index, and then create this collective index which people can do some of those actions I was talking about to improve the nature and in their cities. And the last idea I just wanted to say before I wrap up is this idea of, I think we all come from different walks of lives, and we've all got different skills and different motivations, but actually just putting out some slightly left field ideas, and left field ideas which might just get picked up by somebody in it. So here's a left field idea example on it, where again in urban areas, not right in the urban areas, but in the corridors going into urban areas, often there's electricity pylons going out and connecting out into the countryside. And those electricity pylons always have a footprint. You can't do anything under an electricity pylon. But one idea here was, well, what you could do under it, you could create these sort of identikit prefab refuges, hibernariums, or whatever habitat substrates, which you just stick under the footprints of pylons on it, and offer that to the infrastructure countries as a brand enhancing way of how to become nature positive. And you can imagine these little bits of diversity and stepping stones going out into the countryside and into the cities and building that connectivity. Okay, a little bit of a left field idea, but one which I think it's just an example of this sort of creativity which must be there in urban areas. And what we tend to have in urban areas is the connections. There's all sorts of different people working there, the connections to actually pitch some of these ideas to our infrastructure companies. So what I've done in this talk, I've given you a brief intro, sort of status check on rewilding. I've given you my take, if you like, or my engagement with the European rewilding. Talked about that philosophy of systems thinking, reflected on my experiences in urban conservation and how that urban conservation movement really made a difference in many cities in the 1980s, but has slowly fizzled out. Suggested that there's a new purpose for rewilding, which is a purpose around rebuilding system interactions out of which will come a solution to the mental crisis and build a mental resilience. And that there's just loads of ways to begin with that on urban rewilding. And my just concluding thoughts are really on this slide. First of all, urban rewilding, they're inherently local and contextual. There is no one model on it. To have impact, I do think that an urban rewilding movement would need to be led by council officers and their consultants. But that doesn't mean they have to start it. I think it can be started by citizens doing, I just gave you some examples. I think all of those examples are doable within 2 to 5 years. I don't have time to do them because all my time's taken up with working at sort of more the higher policy institutional level. But I do think that these sort of ideas are really doable if you team up with others from different walks of life, and of course if you mix in a bit of urban attitude into the whole thing. So thanks very much. I look forward to reactions and questions.
Paul, thank you. As ever, given that I work with you on a regular basis, thought-provoking. That's exactly what is coming in the chat as well, as I was saying it. It always happens when you engage with geographers. They've got such a multidisciplinary approach. Their minds go off in all kinds of directions and make you think differently. So that was great. Thank you. Just to deal with the quiz, I think we have a three-way tie in second place from Roanne Lilly, Africa Gomez, and somebody called Debbie Davitt, who I might be married to. Fortunately, all beaten by 1 point, I think, by Georgina, who got 4. So, Georgina, if you just drop us a note to panelists, if you like, to confirm that's the Georgina, I think it is, and I think we've got your contact details.
Congratulations, Georgina. And if you send your surname as well, I'll sign it for you. You know. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Georgina.
Well,
so a few questions. If people have more, do please put them in the Q&A. First one from Rachel is, to what extent of the theory, as in Wilding, that Britain was never fully wooded, more the Vera successional wood pasture kind of thought, how widely accepted or proven is that now?
The idea that Britain was never fully wooded. Yeah, it's a really tricky one for us, actually, because, you know, we came out of the last ice age quite late, so it's never quite sure how much of the megafauna got over, and whether we did, you know, whether after the ice age we did just recover, you know, a bit like Scotland, sort of recovering in the sense, forget the deer, but, you know, just natural regeneration, the trees coming back up. So I'd say that's a moot point at the moment. The fossil record's really poor on what was in Britain. But interestingly, I don't think that stops us thinking, well, you know, the biome is there to be, you know, mosaic-y grassland type areas. You know, when you look around, you know, like we have these warmer ridges and what have you, which you think they probably burnt and they were probably grazed on it. So my view is that you take inspiration from the past, but we're relaxed on shaping the ecological futures.
Separate one then about interaction of people with wilder areas. How can we balance the positive effects of rewilding on people with the need to avoid the detrimental effects of people who are generally detached from nature on nature? So do we, for example, need sacrificial wildlife sites where people can reap the benefits of nature, so urban parks and pedestrian corridors, but also separate restricted areas specifically for biodiversity?
Yeah, it's interesting whether you do need refuge areas. I think ultimately wildlife does need refuge areas and sanctuaries. It's just about how big those are and where they need. I mean, it is amazing what can live in urban areas and find sanctuary in small areas. So I think my argument would say, yes, we need refuge areas, but I'm not sure they necessarily have to be massive. I think they can be interwoven on it. And then the first bit was a bit about the impacts of people, the pros and cons of it.
Yeah.
Was that how it was put, Jeff?
Yeah. Yeah, the benefits to people of being in nature, but sometimes the detriment to nature of the people being there.
Yeah, this is an odd one on it. I do think there is a need to inform people and educate them a little bit more, because I don't think, you know, a lot of it, you know, when I do quite a lot of observations on this, a lot of people just don't know how to act in nature. And, you know, something I've talked about a lot is, again, when we were in Manchester in those days, there was Keep Britain Tidy campaigns. You know, all the schools were full of Keep Britain Tidy campaigns. Every child got the value that you shouldn't throw litter. That's all gone from it. So I think it's a bit more just public education here. And I like the idea that urban natures are just semi-governed spaces. I see this quite a lot with teenagers, actually, how in the summer a lot of teenagers go into nature, and you know, because they're away from everything, they're not under surveillance in the cities, they can do their own thing. So I think personally, I prioritize in urban areas, I prioritize just people getting in there and just doing what they want a little bit within it, but actually trying to build those values so they've got an idea of how to what not to do on it.
Thank you. We're currently on 12 questions, of which I think we've done a couple, so I won't get through all of them, but I will try and sort of group subjects from people. One question about the overlap between rewilding and sustainable land use in urban areas. So, for example, is it better to use available land in an urban area to produce crops or livestock for local use, or to put it over for rewilding? And to what extent can rewilding and low-intensity agriculture coexist?
Yeah, so I think the way I'd answer that one, if we said that, why are we rewilding? What is the general purpose of rewilding? And maybe it is to sort of rebuild those system connections, interconnectivity between different groups in society, and to build collective resilience on it. I think we have to realize that urban farms, gardening and all of that, these are really good. I mean, they're doing those things as well. So I prefer more of a sort of multi-use, or just doing lots of different things in cities. That there may be certain areas which are good for a bit of wilder natures, other areas which we want a bit more formal, other areas which are urban farms, and just to have that multi-use,
that diversity and difference, and not all being the same version.
Yeah, I think that's what people want, because cities are full of, well, everywhere's full of people with different interests and ways of living.
Okay, one about urban rewilding and gardening. So in policy circles, urban land is urban land and rural land is rural, and they don't tend to meet policy-wise. Is urban rewilding really just gardening, or is there a difference? And what should gardeners be doing other than planting street trees and making the bottom of the garden permeable?
Yeah, it's interesting on this is, I think inevitably rewilding in urban areas is going to have a strong gardening element to it, partly because we just love tending things, and it gives a reason for getting out, and it gives a reason for volunteering, and so a lot of urban wildlife groups, I mean, the one down us that they do a sort of conservation gardening. And I think that's fine. I just think for me, it's about maybe just embracing some of these principles of rewilding and thinking about how you can intertwine them into that form of tending, which is very therapeutic for many people. And to be honest, because of urban areas, because there's so many trade-offs we have to balance, there is more need for human ecosystem engineering, and gardening is a form of human ecosystem engineering.
Personally, here in our garden, we've always sort of, what I'd say, nature-friendly gardened. But in the last few years, we've taken it a stage to a wilder thing. So we've got more different areas, a bit more water, more areas that we leave for longer periods and just see what happens. And that's resulted in things like anthills forming in areas that were just mown lawn before.
Yeah, amazing.
So just on a smaller scale, you suddenly start to get more diversity of insects, more interactions, bit of disturbance. If we get trees that get too big, silver birch, we'll take them out and plant new ones. So you're getting that succession. And it's just that willingness to have the disruption and the lack of control. Some areas of the garden we do look after, and we keep what might be termed neater, but other bits we just go. And that diversity and difference, I think, is starting to get into that mindset of just see what happens there if you step back a bit.
Something we're seeing in Oxford, I'd be interesting whether this is more widespread. It's a bit post COVID, is that more friends groups are forming to sort of or manage little pockets. Previously, there might have just been, the council thought they needed to do something, they just, mow them or whatever, send in a contractor. But now they've got this sort of loving care to them, and they're becoming much more dynamic on that. And I think that's a really positive development, which is happening in urban areas, or at least it's happening in Oxford. I don't know whether it's more widespread.
Yeah, there certainly are more community groups. I mean, there's a question about how can we mobilize communities to get involved in urban restoration and optimize citizen science potential. Just look out for local groups. They're springing up all over the place around here. There are examples where in Otley, there's just been a successful bid to buy 20 acres of broadleaf woodland by a community group that put together a crowdfunder in 8 days and became the successful bidder for that. So, I think reach out, look for others around you. There tend to be groups, or if there isn't one, set one up. And you do tend to find like-minded individuals just keen on making a difference and doing something locally, which is very doable.
I might just add to that, though, Jeff. I do think that urban rewilding is about more than actually doing something on the land or on the roofs on it. It's actually just that bit I was trying to make with the music and concept of getting into that, these different bits of urban things. So, putting on film nights sort of in a local cinema or something, just getting people in there, or putting out some competition for, just to do something artistic or creative or whatever. Just trying to get these ideas, this is the narrative bit, the sort of narrative of nature recovery into the cultural mainstream, because I don't think many citizens, when they think of nature, whether they've really clocking the sort of ideas which are bubbling up, which we're familiar with. And a good way of doing that is through the arts and culture and music and whatever.
So that leads us to what I'll make the last question, because time's cracking on, with apologies to people whose questions haven't had a chance to ask Paul. The influence of creativity through music and art confirms how important it is to bring art and science together rather than them continually being siloed apart. How have you seen art and science brought together successfully, or what are your left field ideas for doing that?
Well, I was trying to bring rewilding technology together in all of those images I had in my talk, which, for those of you who know it, that was going to be another quiz question, but they're just all, created with this new consumer AI, where you just write in an image you want on it. So, I think it's partly about, it's all about curation at the end of the day, and it's somebody thinking, you know what, I'm into nature, but I love me music and I love me art, or just something like this. I'll get together with somebody and I'm just going to curate a little festival, like you curated a series of lectures. You just create a series of events on it. And, again, something which I think works really well is when people look around for venues in cities, and there's always funny venues which you can get, things, it might be just, something like a cinema which you can rent for a night or a certain time of day, or a building which is being refurbed or whatever. And just then reaching out, because there's a lot of people who want to do, want an audience, and, just taking, I think that's the way to make these connections. It's just think about curating something.
And I can't miss the chance to mention the Yorkshire Rewilding Festival that YRM will be staging this summer, which involves a series of combined art and rewilding, which will include some of the science stuff. Paul, I'm pleased to say, is joining us at the York Festival Ideas for that in June. We've also got around Otley various events happening at the end of June, and then various site visits with a festival theme happening through the summer. So we'll be putting more about that in our next newsletter, which probably goes out next week. So if you haven't signed up for it, get onto our website and have a look for that. And as John said at the start, we do need funding from people to keep going. So if you can afford to make a small donation or join our Wild 100 Club, again, details on there, that would be really appreciated. But let me bring this to a close by thanking Paul for what I say is a very wide-ranging chat. It's been lovely to see all of your participation, both in the quiz, although that's the hardest I've had to work during a webinar to keep the scores, and on the chat. Lots of sharing going on with Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, some of the local community groups. I saw one from Sheffield about here's where you can check out community groups and getting them established, as well as some other projects sharing their details. So absolutely what YRN is all about. We rely on people like Paul, who's given us his time this evening most generously. And thank you all for joining. Our next webinar is the 15th of March, more about wasps and bees and their role in rewilding, sort of different imagination of what we sometimes see as pests. So again, you can register free on the website for that one. And we hope to see many of you here for that. and tell your friends, get them along, and we'll see you in, what must that be, 3 weeks' time. Thanks again, Paul, and to John as well for the intro. I'll end the webinar there. Thank you.
Thanks
Bye
very much,
now.
all.